During this time, Georges Pompidou was the prime minister of President Charles de Gaulle and actually became his successor as president after the events of May. Pompidou himself was a student of French literature. He was famously loved poetry and art. He also famously loved technology and progressive technology, including the use of the automobile. Charles de Gaulle had wanted a public library on the site, and Pompidou, after being so affected by the events of May, expanded that program. He now wanted a center for cultural production, a center that would include cinema to show avant-garde films, would include a bookstore as well as a library. It would include children's playrooms. It would include parking for 20,000 cars and I think like 1,500 buses. What he was proposing was an anti-monumental facility available to the general public that would invite the public in to this Center for Advanced Art. An international competition was launched. It received almost 700 entries from all over the world, and the team of Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers won. From the very first sketch, you can see how radical their proposal was. They put an enormous emphasis on the plaza in front of the building, slightly sloped toward the building so that the surface of the building and the plaza worked together to form this outdoor urban space. In the original scheme, the ground floor was completely open to the air, as if to extend that plaza under the building. They later had to enclose it in for security reasons, but the idea of the freedom of that space is still there. The public library occupies the first 3 levels. The museum and the library overlap on the 3rd floor, and the museum continues up to the 4th and the 5th floor. On the 4th and 5th floor, there are terraces that you can actually move outside of the museum into, again, the space of the city. And from the very top floor, you get this amazing view of the city of Paris, including, of course, the Eiffel Tower. And that comparison between the Centre Pompidou and the Eiffel Tower comes back. The building is extremely flexible. It was even meant that the building could be dismantled, that the mechanical equipment, which of course would quickly become obsolete, could be very easily replaced. It's an open work. It's an open assemblage that completely changed the standards in the construction industry. The building itself comprised a series of floors uncluttered by columns, supported by enormous trusses. The trusses are almost 50 feet spanning, and then an additional zone on the outside you can see where mechanical services and circulation escalators were provided. The construction employs a prefabricated cast steel, which was actually quite unusual. You can see that the trusses are held up then by the columns. At the end of the building, there's this diagrid, which sort of ends the short side of the building. You could argue that the building doesn't have a facade as such. It's not the facade, say, of Palladio of Alberti. On the other hand, it's a surface that in some way functions like a traditional architectural facade. On the east elevation is where all of the mechanical services are, and they're color-coded: yellow for the electrical, blue for the heating and ventilation, green for plumbing. The point here is not just to make the services legible, the point is coding itself. Because this building is a network of information, of languages, of signs and symbols. The steel and glass gives a certain sort of transparency. There's a transparency between inside and outside, which is exactly the opposite of the concealing function of the stone at the Whitney. In front of that, supported by these brackets, is a thin network of horizontals, verticals, and diagonals that operate mainly in tension together with these little brackets and struts to give stability. The floors, which are steel poured in concrete, also give lateral stability. But what's important about the surface in front of the Place Beaubourg is that it becomes a kind of scaffolding or a support structure for different kinds of information. You can read it as a kind of diagram of tensile forces. An engineer would see that as a kind of structural force field. It's also a kind of surface that you can hang urban scaled art. Of course, it also, in between those two levels of material, are the famous escalators that symbolically show the flow of people into and out of the center. As a person ascends on the escalator, you come into very, very close contact with these enormous cast steel pieces. You see each element. I think it's very important that there's very, very little field welding. Almost everything is connected with bolts so that the connectivity is very apparent, the idea of connection. But then there's also other kinds of connectivities as you ascend, as you go into the terraces, you start visually connecting with urban spaces itself. It's as if all different sorts of spaces of the city can have somehow conceptually been brought together into this single sort of heterotopia, which is the Centre Pompidou. So while the building is rhetorically very technical and functional, it's also very architectural as Alberti's facade, but the way it provides this surface onto which this kind of ornamentation is applied. It could be understood as a sort of laminates. It's almost like a series of X-rays that have become collapsed together, where all this different kinds of information is connected. In some ways, the interiors are unremarkable except for their enormous flexibility. But on the other hand, they recognize that a younger generation of artists, a generation of artists that's coming into their own in the 1960s and 70s, are actually looking for different kinds of spaces, not like the Whitney's galleries, but spaces where different kinds of art could be produced, where the distinction between painting and sculpture and performance starts to break down, where the very distinction between the interior gallery space and the spaces of the city begin to break down. And the Pompidou tries to find a new architectural space to represent those changes.